How's it going, everybody? Recently, I was hired to do the music for the visual novel Solanacy based on the webtoon by Dark Chibi Shadow. And when I was talking with them about doing the music and what kind of sounds they wanted, one of the main things that kept coming up was it should be kind of goofy, fantasy-oriented, and it is whimsical. Whimsy is kind of a weird feeling. It's a very complex feeling when you try and break it down. Sort of like how everybody experiences love in a different way. But whimsy, while it's identifiable pretty easily, is not exactly something that is easy to express. And that's probably because it's pretty difficult to actually understand what being whimsical actually means. Think about it this way. Have you yourself ever actually felt whimsical? I mean, at least while sober. Chances are you probably haven't actually felt whimsical before, at least not in a clear enough way that you could describe it to someone else. And this is because whimsy is something that we associate with other people or situations instead of ourselves. And like I was saying before, complex feelings like love and whimsy aren't exactly difficult to translate into clearly defined musical ideas, but there's something about actually trying to describe what is going on that makes them so much more complex than, say, something like happiness or sadness. And based on my own understanding of whimsy, I put together a list here that sort of broadly covers the general idea of how you can understand whimsy in music. So when you look at the definition of whimsy, it says something about doing things on whims or making decisions based on fleeting ideas or in-the-moment decisions that don't really affect things one way or the other. And in simple terms, that's sort of how whimsy works, but it's not exactly how we think of it. And when you make a decision based on nothing other than what you're feeling like doing in the moment, that doesn't necessarily translate to music in the same way that the idea of whimsy does. And so to capture the idea of a whimsical piece of music, we tend to think of music that has high tones, like something in the flutes or the violins, and usually they'll be playing quick runs. There also tends to be a lot of chromaticism and diatonicism, so this is what you think of when someone is playing a scale or just playing all the notes on a piano in succession. It doesn't necessarily mean playing all of them, but the idea is that the music is moving in stepwise motion. And this helps it feel a lot more playful and lose the rigidity of staying in one key all the time. There also tends to be a lot of staccato in these flighty running high tones, so things that just kind of play off like this in succession. And sort of related to chromaticism and diatonicism, if the piece is supposed to be kind of mischievous, then you're going to hear a lot of things like non-perfect intervals. So things like diminished intervals and augmented intervals are pretty common when it comes to mischievous pieces. And you'll also tend to get things that are minor rather than major, and on occasion you'll also get the odd tritone or two. And for those of you who are a little less musically inclined, basically these are all the things in music that sound a little bit wonky. And so I've got a few examples just to run through what this kind of sounds like. So the first example here is from the video game Ni no Kuni with the soundtrack by the legendary Joe Hisaishi. So when you first hear this, you can tell it's obviously really playful, and you can tell it's sort of whimsical based on all of the rules we went over before. There are high tones, there are quick runs, there's staccatos, there's chromaticism, and there's also some mischief that comes to the forefront as the piece goes on. This second example is from Princess Connect, which I've talked about before, and the music in that tends to have a sort of goofy aesthetic because the game itself also has a fairly goofy aesthetic. And again, you can hear all of the things that we talked about before, the high tones with the plucked strings, the sort of quick staccato pattern that they're playing. There isn't quite so much chromaticism in this, but it is still very diatonic, running up and down the scales. And because it lacks the sort of chromaticism that the previous one had, it doesn't sound quite as mischievous. And here we have another fairly different example, but one that still seems to capture that idea of whimsy. This example's from Genshin Impact and is the main theme music for Liyue, the area of the game that's based off of China. We have a slightly different take on the idea of whimsy, with the main melody being played in the pentatonic scale, which is common of East Asian music, and it still manages to go through each of the rules that we went over before and capture the idea of whimsy. The interesting part of this example and of the first example are that they actually become quite grand over the span of their runtime, but the music still manages to hold on to that sense of whimsy no matter how grand the piece becomes. And so now you might be thinking, well, if this is how you make whimsical sounding music, it must be pretty easy. But even though I set up those rules from before, there's something about them that isn't quite right. Even if a piece of music has all of those things that I mentioned, it doesn't necessarily make the piece of music whimsical. And on the flip side, music that doesn't follow these rules can still sound whimsical itself. So let's take a listen to some of these other tracks and see if we can figure out what's going on. So this is one of my favorite tracks from the game Gravity Rush 2, and it's called Enchanted Zone by Tanaka Kohei. And the thing about this track is that it doesn't actually break any of the rules that I listed off before, but it does kind of show off that mischief can completely overtake the sort of, I guess, regular happy feeling, the sort of innocent happy feeling that you think of when you think whimsy. The first thing that pops into my head, and I'm not entirely sure why, is dandelions. Like the little cotton puffs that kind of blow off in the wind. Something about them running through a field of those seems whimsical, and that's the first thing that I think of. But when I hear this track, there's nothing about dandelions going through my head. This sounds kind of spooky and off-putting. There's something that's sort of off-kilter about it, something that makes it hard to follow, but also something that you want to follow, if that kind of makes sense. And you can hear in that first falling and rising melody that there are tons of augmented and diminished intervals in it. And the frequent use of seventh intervals, which makes the music sort of clash and not resolve to anything, is a great way to add a bit of mischief into the music that we're hearing. I've talked about Outset Island a little bit before, and it has probably the most classic sound of whimsy. There's tons of staccato, and the melody is mainly up high in the flutes and the clarinet, and everything sort of seems to be going the way we would expect, but if you look at the rules again, the very first one is broken, because the track opens up with the bassoon, which is a woodwind, so it kind of captures the sound of whimsy that we should be familiar with, but it plays it in a completely different way because the bassoon is such a low instrument. So even those first few notes that are just going up and down are already whimsical before any of the other higher tones come in. Now, this might be a weird exception because often the bassoon is used in these kinds of situations. The bassoon has a sort of sound that we associate with comedy, and on top of the instrument itself just sounding kind of whimsical on its own, it's possible that it's also the pattern it's playing is adding to that sense of silliness and fun. This might not be a hard set rule, but a lot of these whimsical tracks feature quite a bit of syncopation, which is where a melody might play notes on the offbeats, or possibly in between the on and the offbeats. And so for the time being, we might as well just add that to the bottom of the list, but keep in mind that it's not a hard set rule. And now you can see why that last rule isn't exactly hard set. This track from Granblue Fantasy is basically as straight as you can go in terms of the melody and rhythm. You can see that it follows a lot of the rules that we went over before, but it breaks the staccato one pretty much right away. The quick running flute line that runs up from the beginning is pretty whimsical, but the problem with it is that it isn't staccato whatsoever. Sure, there are a few staccato notes towards the end of the phrase, but they act more like one-offs that just help the melody push itself along. It's not like all of these tracks are entirely whimsical from start to finish, but it's these sections in between that break the rules that make you kind of wonder, well, if you can break the rules that you set up and still sound whimsical, then what are the rules? And on the flip side of all of that, you get the tracks that actually follow these rules, but were never meant to be whimsical in general. So now you've got tracks that are following these rules, but don't actually sound whimsical at all. Like, for example, this famous one. Now, you could probably argue that One Winged Angel has quite a few sections that sound whimsical, and that it's just the context and the knowledge of the track that makes you realize, well, this track probably isn't whimsical at all. It sort of sounds scary, imposing, and none of that makes the whimsical sections sound very whimsical unless you were to pluck them right out of the track and just listen to them on their own. And that's fair enough, but then you get a track like Kefka's theme from Final Fantasy VI, which follows quite a few of the same rules as One Winged Angel, but then also sounds whimsical. And obviously when you're comparing Sephiroth and Kefka, you can kind of tell which one's going to have a more whimsical theme just by looking at them, but being able to capture the main idea of making both of them sound imposing while only one sounds whimsical is something that isn't really easy to explain. Here we've got a track from Fire Emblem Awakening, which is the theme that you hear anytime Tiki is involved. And as you can hear from the harp melody, there's a lot of quick high staccato runs that should be making the track sound whimsical. But from the very start, nothing about this track seems whimsical at all. And while you could argue that the harp itself just sounds a little bit too elegant to be considered whimsical, here's a track that I wrote a few years ago that features a harp line that I would argue is quite whimsical. It obviously doesn't have the same whimsical sound as all the other tracks we've been hearing, but that's probably just because of the instrument itself again. You might also argue that the pentatonic scale or that the minor key that it's in make it sound a little too serious to be whimsical, but we already talked about the pentatonic scale with Genshin Impact, and then we also heard the minor key for Gravity Rush 2. Just something to think about. And this is a track that I wrote a few years ago that's supposed to mix the sort of sound of Final Fantasy with the Family Mart jingle. The pattern playing here isn't super high, but the strings are doubling on the octave in the middle and the one above, so you do get that high sound out of the violins running downwards. You can hear that it's following most of the rules that I set up before, but it doesn't actually sound whimsical until it cuts out of this section and has a little clip of the Family Mart jingle right in the middle of it all. And it's only for that really brief moment when the Family Mart jingle plays, and the only explanation I can say for that is that maybe the plucked strings sound a little bit shorter than the staccato notes. Or maybe it's just the contrast from being imposing to going to something a little bit silly. Though I wouldn't really say the same thing for Sephiroth's theme, so where does that really leave us? I'll be perfectly honest, I don't actually have a conclusive finding on this. I just thought that it would be something fun to discuss. You can kind of capture whimsy through any combination of these rules, but none of them are set in stone because you can have a track that doesn't have any of these that still sounds whimsical. Not that I can think of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are some out there. And like I was saying before, these rules kind of help define how you can identify whimsy or sort of figure out why something sounds whimsical, but it isn't so much about the rules themselves as the way that they're being applied to the music. There are too many specifics and stylizations that actually make the music itself sound whimsical, rather than just these rules that you can arbitrarily throw together into a piece and hope that it sounds the way that you want it to. And this is all pretty subjective because something that sounds whimsical to you might not sound whimsical to someone else, and maybe it only sounds whimsical because you know the context, or Maybe it's the other way around. It sounds whimsical because you don't know the context. And in that same vein, you could kind of say that a whimsical piece only sounds whimsical in one part, or maybe the piece itself doesn't sound whimsical at all, except for that one part, and that just kind of begs the question of whether the piece is whimsical at all. Basically, whimsy is just like any other complex feeling that needs to be felt yourself or experienced sort of secondhand. And like all of those other complex feelings, it's better to express it rather than try to explain it. And basically, that's just my take on a topic that I don't think anyone was asking for. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully you also learned something a little more about the feeling of whimsy and how it can be translated through music. If you have any more conclusive ideas about what makes music sound whimsical, let me know down in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to hear me ramble on about how other complex feelings, emotions, or just situations in general can be translated through music, make sure to support me over on Patreon so that I can keep doing this kind of thing more often. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.